Imagine a fighter plane so deadly that it terrified its own pilots more than the enemy. An aircraft that the U.S. Navy banned from their carriers because too many young men were dying just trying to land it. A machine nicknamed the Ensign Eliminator because it kept killing inexperienced pilots during training. Now picture that same aircraft becoming the most feared weapon in the Pacific, racking up an 11-to-1 kill ratio and making Japanese pilots pray they wouldn't have to face it. This is the paradox of the Vought F-4U Corsair, a story of how the deadliest American fighter almost destroyed the men who flew it before becoming their greatest weapon. In the desperate winter of 1941, after Pearl Harbor turned America's Pacific Fleet into burning wreckage, the situation looked hopeless. The Japanese war machine was unstoppable. Within 6 months of the attack, Imperial forces had conquered an empire spanning from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Dutch East Indies to the edge of Australia. They'd humiliated the British at Singapore, captured tens of thousands of Americans in the Philippines, and seemed poised to win the entire Pacific War before America could even mobilize. At the heart of this dominance flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter so superior that American pilots spoke of it with genuine dread. Light as a feather, unbelievably maneuverable, and flown by veteran pilots who'd been fighting in China for years, the Zero swept American planes from the sky with contemptuous ease. Sure, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat could survive if you used specific tactics, diving attacks, and team coordination, but you couldn't chase a Zero, couldn't climb with it, and God help you if you try to turn with one. American commanders knew they desperately needed something better, a fighter that could dictate the terms of combat instead of always reacting to Japanese advantages. What those commanders didn't know was that their superweapon already existed. It had been flying since 1940, sitting in hangars across America, ready to change everything. It was faster than any fighter in the sky, carried more guns than anything Japan could field, and could climb like a homesick angel. There was just one problem. It killed American pilots so efficiently that the Navy had declared it too dangerous for carrier duty. The weapon that could save them was grounded by its own lethality. The man who created this beautiful monster came from the most unlikely background imaginable. Rex Buren Beisel was born in October of 1893 in San Jose, California, but grew up in Cumberland, Washington, a hardscrabble coal mining town in the Cascade foothills. His father dug coal from the earth, working in darkness and danger to feed his family. Young Rex worked there too, sorting coal from rock as a breaker boy, guiding mules through black tunnels, washing the endless dust from the fuel. He went to Queen and High School in Seattle while spending his summers underground, learning that when mechanical systems fail in a coal mine, people die. But Rex Beisel had something that transcended those dark tunnels, an almost supernatural gift for understanding how machines worked, for seeing systems that didn't exist yet, for solving problems that stumped everyone else. When America entered the Great War in 1917, Beisel found his escape route. He got a job in the infant aviation industry as a draftsman, earning $4 a day. He had zero formal training in aeronautics, almost no textbooks to study, but he taught himself everything, designing seaplane hulls and pontoons, filling notebooks with calculations and sketches. His talent was so obvious that by November of 1919, at just 26 years old, he'd become one of the few certified aeronautical engineers in the entire country. Through the 20s and 30s, his career exploded. He designed the TS-1, the first Navy fighter built to actual naval specifications. Curtiss Aeroplane hired him at 29 as their chief engineer. His racing planes won the Pulitzer Trophy. He created the N-2C, one fledgling that trained an entire generation of Naval Reserve pilots. He designed the famous F-8C Helldiver dive bomber. By the time Vought brought him on as chief engineer in the mid-30s, Rex Beisel had risen from the coal mines to the absolute pinnacle of aviation design. Then came February of 1938, when the Navy issued a request that would define his legacy. They wanted a carrier-based fighter that could achieve maximum obtainable speed, with a stalling speed under 70 miles per hour, a range of 1,000 miles, heavy armament, and the ability to operate from carrier decks. These requirements pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. Beisel assembled a brilliant team: Frank Albright for structural design, Paul Baker for aerodynamics, James Shoemaker for propulsion integration. Their approach was radical. They'd build the smallest possible airframe around the most powerful engine available, the new Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster producing over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what contemporary fighters had. But that massive engine created an immediate crisis. Converting all that power to thrust required an enormous propeller, and they settled on a Hamilton Standard unit measuring 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, the largest propeller ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. Here's the problem. A propeller that huge would smash into the runway on takeoff with conventional landing gear. The tips would dig into the ground, destroying the prop and probably killing the pilot. And carrier operations demanded short, sturdy landing gear that could survive the brutal deceleration of arrested landings. These requirements seemed fundamentally incompatible. Beissel's solution was pure genius. He designed an inverted gull wing that bent downward at the root before angling back up toward the tips. This configuration let them use much shorter landing gear struts while maintaining ground clearance for that massive propeller. The main gear attached at the lowest point of the gull, keeping everything short and strong. As a bonus, the gull wing actually reduced drag where the wing met the fuselage, improving speed. It was elegant problem-solving that gave the Corsair its unforgettable silhouette, that distinctive bent wing shape that would become iconic. Every other aspect was optimized for pure speed. The fuselage was kept impossibly narrow, just wide enough for the engine and pilot. The landing gear retracted completely, rotating 90 degrees so the wheels lay flat inside the wings. Oil coolers and air intakes were buried in wing slots instead of external scoops. Even the rivets were flush with the skin. Nothing compromised speed. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman Bullard took the prototype into the air from Bridgeport, Connecticut. The flight went well until the elevator trim tabs failed and he had to make an emergency landing, an ominous hint of control problems to come. But subsequent flights were spectacular. On October 1, 1940, the XF-4U-1 made history, achieving an average ground speed of 405 miles per hour on a flight from Stratford to Hartford. It became the first single-engine American fighter to crack 400 miles per hour in level flight. Contemporary fighters like the P-40 Warhawk struggled to reach 350. The Corsair was in a completely different league, faster than anything America, Japan, or Germany was flying. The Navy was ecstatic. In June of 1941, they ordered 584 production models. The aircraft was officially named Corsair. Everything looked perfect. Then production modifications turned their superfighter into a death trap. The Navy wanted heavier armament in the production version, 6 50-caliber machine guns instead of 4. Reasonable request. More firepower saves lives. But fitting 6 guns required redesigning the wing panels, and those guns displaced the fuel tanks in each wing's leading edge. Suddenly, the Corsair couldn't meet range requirements. The only solution was installing an 87-gallon fuel tank between the cockpit and engine, and that tank created a catastrophic problem. To maintain the narrow fuselage profile that gave the Corsair its speed, they couldn't just stack the cockpit on top of the new tank. The cockpit had to stay low and sleek, which meant moving it nearly 3 feet aft, behind the fuel tank. This single decision, driven by the need for range and speed, would prove deadly. With the cockpit repositioned so far back, that long nose now completely blocked the pilot's forward view during the most critical flight phases. Sitting in a Corsair on the ground, you couldn't see anything directly ahead. That massive engine cowling, stretching more than 13 feet forward, obscured everything. During takeoff, pilots had to weave the aircraft side to check for obstacles. During landing approaches, they were essentially flying blind, unable to see the runway or carrier deck until the final seconds before touchdown. But poor visibility was just the beginning. The production Corsair exhibited vicious stall behavior absent from the prototype. When airspeed dropped too low, the left wing would stall before the right wing, caused by torque from that massive engine and propeller. This asymmetric stall made the aircraft snap, roll violently left with almost no warning. One moment you're flying normally, the next you're inverted and diving toward the ground. At low altitude, there's no time to recover. That powerful engine produced tremendous torque at slow speeds, constantly pulling the aircraft left. Inexperienced pilots fought the controls during takeoff and landing, exactly when they needed full attention elsewhere. The original tail wheel strut was too short, creating a pronounced nose-up attitude on the ground that made taxiing difficult and further reduced visibility. Pilots had to taxi in S-turns, constantly turning to see around that enormous nose. The landing gear struts, designed to absorb the shock of carrier landings, had a nasty tendency to bounce the aircraft back into the air after touchdown. You'd think you'd landed safely, then suddenly you're airborne again, often in a stall condition with no warning and no time to react. The cowl flap actuators leaked oil onto the windshield, degrading visibility exactly when pilots needed to see clearly. Oil smeared across the windscreen made judging distance and alignment nearly impossible during approaches. These problems combined to make carrier landings terrifyingly dangerous. Carrier landings demand precision measured in feet and seconds. You must catch an arresting cable with your tail hook, stopping from flying speed to zero in a very short distance. The margin for error is essentially nothing. Miss all the cables and you hit the barrier net. Come in too slow and you stall into the stern. Too fast and you miss the cables entirely. The Corsair's combination of poor visibility, unpredictable stalls, bouncing gear, oil leaks, and torque made this precise operation nearly impossible. Pilots who'd successfully landed dozens of other aircraft types found the Corsair terrifying. The first Corsair Squadron, VF-12, received their aircraft in October of 1942 at Naval Air Station San Diego. Almost immediately, young pilots started dying. These were ensigns, the lowest officer rank, fresh from training with minimal experience. They'd learned in docile aircraft like the North American SNJ, which forgave mistakes and rarely punished poor technique. The Corsair forgave nothing. If you jammed the throttle forward on takeoff, the tremendous torque could flip the airplane onto its back before you could react. The engine literally tried to rotate the entire aircraft around the propeller shaft. Pilots who didn't anticipate this with opposite rudder found themselves upside down at 50 feet with zero chance of recovery. If you let airspeed drop too low on approach, the left wing would suddenly stall, snapping the aircraft into an unrecoverable roll. Land too firmly, and the struts would bounce you back into the air where you'd stall and crash. A dark nickname emerged, the Ensign Eliminator, for its tendency to kill inexperienced aviators. Others called it the Bent Wing Eliminator, the Hog, or simply the Beast. More Corsairs were being lost in training accidents than would ever be lost to enemy action. Pilots who survived their first flights spoke with awe at its power and genuine fear of its behavior. Veterans warned newcomers that the Corsair would kill you if you gave it the slightest opportunity. It demanded constant attention, constant correction, constant vigilance. Any lapse could be fatal. By early 1943, the Navy's carrier aviation commanders reached a painful conclusion. The Corsair was simply too dangerous for carrier operations. Training accidents were destroying aircraft faster than factories could build them. Young pilots were dying in crashes that shouldn't happen. The Navy made a defining decision: divert all Corsairs to land-based Marine squadrons while filling carrier units with the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was about 15 miles per hour slower than the Corsair at altitude, but it was a joy to fly from carriers. Forgiving stall characteristics, excellent visibility, predictable landing behavior. The Navy took the safer aircraft. The Marines got the faster one and would fly it from land bases where the margin for error was somewhat greater. The Marines were desperate and willing to accept the risks. Their pilots had been fighting in the Solomons with obsolete Wildcats, struggling to intercept Japanese bombers attacking Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Wildcat could hold its own in certain circumstances, but lacked the climb rate and altitude performance to intercept enemy formations before they reached their targets. Japanese bombers would approach high, drop their bombs, and leave before Marine pilots could climb high enough to engage. The Marines needed something that could get high fast. The Corsair, for all its faults, could do exactly that. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, became the first Marine squadron to receive Corsairs. They were declared operational on December 28, 1942, even though pilots averaged only 25 hours each in the aircraft, dangerously little experience with such a demanding machine. But the need was desperate. On February 12, 1943, 12 Corsairs of VMF 124 arrived at Henderson Field, led by Major William Guise. The Marines had their new fighters. Now they had to learn to survive flying them while simultaneously fighting the Japanese. The Corsairs' combat debut came on arrival day. Before lunch on February 12th, the 12F-4S escorted a PBY Catalina on a 230-mile mission to pick up downed pilots. Uneventful, just familiarization. 2 days later, on February 14th, 1943, the Corsair faced its first real test, and the results were sobering. Several Corsairs from VMF 1, 2, 4 joined a force escorting B-24 Liberators raiding the Japanese aerodrome at Kahili on Bougainville. Army P-38s and P-40s joined the escort. Japanese fighters rose in force. The result was disaster, called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 4 P-38s shot down. 2 Corsairs lost. 2 Liberators didn't return. Against these 8 American losses, Japanese records confirm only 1-0 destroyed from a mid-air collision when 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Siegel's Corsair collided with Petty Officer Yoshio Yoshida 0. Both pilots died. The Corsair's first combat day produced no conventional aerial victories. 8 Corsairs went into that fight. 2 didn't return. The survivors had struggled against experienced Japanese pilots in nimble Zeros. The Corsair's superior speed meant nothing if pilots didn't know how to use it. American pilots had tried fighting the Zero on its terms, engaging in slow-speed turning battles where Japanese aircraft excelled and Japanese pilots had years of experience. The results were predictable and tragic. But the Marines didn't quit. They studied their failures and learned. Survivors began developing tactics specifically designed to exploit the Corsair's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. They analyzed every encounter, discussed what worked, and developed doctrine that would eventually make the Corsair the most feared American fighter in the Pacific. The key insight was that altitude was everything. The Corsair could climb faster and fly higher than the Zero. Whoever had altitude dictated the battle's terms, and Zero pilots couldn't change that fundamental advantage. A Corsair pilot starting from superior altitude could choose when and how to engage. Dive on the enemy, attack, and use superior speed to climb away before Zeros could respond. If you chose not to fight, you simply stayed high and Zeros couldn't catch you. The Corsair could outperform a Zero in every aspect except slow-speed maneuverability and slow-speed climb. Therefore, experienced pilots learned to avoid getting slow when fighting Zeros. They dive on enemy formations from high altitude, make a single lethal pass with 650 caliber machine guns blazing, then use superior speed to climb away. They called it boom and zoom. Boom down from altitude, unleash deadly gunfire, then zoom back up for another attack. If a Zero got on your tail, you didn't try to outturn it. That was suicide. Instead, you dove away, knowing the Zero couldn't follow in a high-speed dive without tearing its wings off, then climb back up. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 became the first Corsair ace on May 13, 1943, after shooting down his 5th enemy aircraft. Walsh had enlisted in 1933 at 17, serving as an aircraft mechanic before earning his wings in 1937. He was one of the Corps' most experienced pilots. Walsh claimed his first 3 Japanese planes on April 1, 1943, adding 2 more on May 13th. By August's end, Walsh had brought his score to 20 victories, becoming the most successful Corsair pilot to that point. Walsh received the Medal of Honor for 2 August engagements. On August 15th, he repeatedly dove into an enemy formation outnumbering his division 6-1, shooting down 2 dive bombers and a fighter despite taking numerous hits. On August 30th, when his engine failed during an escort mission, he landed at a forward airfield, borrowed another Corsair, flew to catch his escort group, and when he encountered approximately 50 Zeros attacking his bombers, Walsh attacked alone with what his citation called relentless fury, destroying 4 enemy fighters before making a dead-stick landing in the ocean, where friendly forces rescued him. In September of 1943, a new squadron arrived that would become legendary. Marine Fighting Squadron 214 was reconstituted at Espiritu Santo under Major Gregory Boyington. Boyington was already a combat veteran with a controversial past. He'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China before America entered the war, claiming 6 victories. He'd resigned under circumstances involving money disputes and personality conflicts, then struggled to rejoin the Marines when war came. Boyington was 30 when he took command, a decade older than most pilots. They nicknamed him Pappy for his age. He was known for hard drinking and aggressive, sometimes abrasive personality. The squadron assembled from replacement pilots who'd been orphans without permanent assignments. They nicknamed their unit the Black Sheep because they'd all been unwanted elsewhere. The original suggestion was Boyington's Bastards, but Marine Public Information decided that wouldn't play well in newspapers. Under Boyington's aggressive leadership, the Black Sheep compiled an extraordinary record. From September of 1943 to January of 1944, during just 84 days of operations, VMF 214 destroyed or damaged over 200 enemy aircraft. The squadron produced 9 aces and was credited with 97 confirmed victories. Boyington became the top-scoring Marine ace of the war, eventually credited with 28 total victories, combining his Flying Tiger and Marine Corps scores. On January 3, 1944, Boyington led a fighter sweep over Rabaul when his formation encountered a large enemy force. In the battle, Boyington shot down at least one aircraft before being shot down himself. He parachuted into the ocean and was captured by a Japanese submarine. For 20 months, he endured brutal treatment as a prisoner of war. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously as he was believed dead. But Boyington survived and was liberated from a Maury prison camp in August of 1945, returning home to receive his medal from President Truman. While Marines wrote their legend in the Solomons, a Navy squadron was proving the Corsair could succeed in naval hands. Fighter Squadron 17 formed on January 1, 1943, at Norfolk under Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn. Blackburn recruited Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick as executive officer. Together, they'd build one of the most successful squadrons in naval history. VF-17 was selected to fly Corsairs, becoming the second Navy squadron to receive the Gull-Wing fighter. Blackburn understood the aircraft's piratical name deserved a matching identity. Squadron pilot Harry Hallimeyer designed an image that became legendary, a white skull and crossbones on black background. They called themselves the Jolly Rogers. The squadron quickly developed a reputation for being unconventional. Blackburn encouraged aggressive flying and didn't always discourage raucous behavior. What mattered was performance. They trained intensely with their Corsairs, nicknamed Hogs because the aircraft handled, in their words, like a hog on ice. One pilot ran a truck off a highway playing chicken in an inverted Corsair. Another held an impromptu, low-level dogfight over residential Norfolk. This flat-hatting earned them a transfer to rural Manteo, North Carolina, where they completed training away from civilian complaints. VF-17 worked closely with Vought engineers to modify their Corsairs rather than switching to the easier Hellcat. Lieutenant Butch Davenport helped develop an airflow spoiler on the right wing, keeping wings level in low-speed stalls. This modification became standard on later models. Despite improvements, the Navy decided to replace all carrier Corsair squadrons with Hellcats. VF-17 was reassigned to land-based duty. The Jolly Rogers would prove themselves from island airfields. The squadron reached Ondongo on New Georgia in October of 1943, participating in air cover for the Cape Torquena landings on Bougainville on November 1st. During deployment, VF-17 flew against the cream of Imperial Navy pilots based at Rabaul. In their combat debut on November 1st, Blackburn downed 2 enemy aircraft and the squadron claimed 3 more. On November 8th, 6 Jolly Rogers faced 15 dive bombers escorted by 24 Zeros. VF-17 destroyed multiple enemy aircraft without losing a single Corsair. In 76 days of Solomon's combat, the Jolly Rogers compiled extraordinary records. They destroyed 154 enemy aircraft with an 8-to-1 loss ratio. The squadron flew 8,577 combat hours and sank 5 ships. Most remarkably, no bomber they escorted was ever shot down by enemy fighters, even during missions against heavily defended Rabaul. The squadron produced 13 aces. Ira Kepford led with 16 victories. Roger Hedrick scored 12. Blackburn finished with 11, earning the Navy Cross. Among Marine pilots, one man's meteoric rise became legendary. First Lieutenant Robert Murray Hanson of VMF 215 was the son of Methodist missionaries who'd served decades in India. Born in Lucknow on February 4, 1920, Young Hansen grew up playing with Hindu children and attending Woodstock School in the Western Himalayas. He became both light heavyweight and heavyweight wrestling champion of the United Provinces before returning to America at Hamline University. He continued wrestling while working as a bouncer to pay for flying lessons. Hansen earned his Marine wings in February of 1943 and first saw combat with the original VMF 214 before that squadron became the Black Sheep under Boyington. Other pilots noted Hansen as somewhat belligerent, easily taking dislike to other flyers, but he was an excellent gunner with extraordinary combat instincts. On November 1st, 1943, during Bougainville landings, Hansen single-handedly attacked 6 Japanese torpedo bombers with such ferocity that several jettisoned bombs before reaching targets. 3 fell in flames under his guns. He was shot down that day by return fire and spent 6 hours paddling a rubber raft in enemy waters, singing Cole Porter's "You'd Be So Nice to Come Home" to keep his spirits up. The destroyer Sigsbee rescued him, and he returned to combat immediately. During VMF 215's second tour, flying from Torquay against Rabaul, Hansen went on a destruction spree, earning the nickname Butcher Bob. In just 17 days, he shot down 20 enemy aircraft. On January 14, 1944, the fighting Corsairs escorted bombers to Simpson Harbor and encountered a large fighter formation. Hansen downed 5 Zeros in the Wild Dog fight. On January 24th, separated from his squadron deep in enemy territory, Hansen flew his lone Corsair directly into a Zero formation orbiting to attack American bombers. Striking with ferocious determination, he brought down 4 and probably a 5th, breaking up the attack. On January 30th, 1944, VMF 215 escorted Avengers to Rabaul. The Japanese responded with overwhelming force. The fighting Corsairs claimed 21 enemy aircraft with 4 credited to Hansen. His total stood at 25 victories, making him the highest-scoring Marine Corsair ace of the entire war. He was scheduled to return home in just over a week. On February 3rd, one day before his 24th birthday, Hansen participated in a fighter sweep over Rabaul. On the return flight, the formation passed Cape St. George on New Ireland, where a Japanese lighthouse acted as fire control for anti-aircraft guns. Hansen left formation to strafe the position. His plane was hit. His guns ceased firing. The Corsair's nose lifted slightly, then dove into the sea. Captain Harold Spears watched as the plane cartwheeled when one wing caught a wave. It disintegrated on impact. Hansen was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the 3rd and last Corsair pilot to receive that honor during World War II. While Marines learned to fight with the Corsair in the Pacific, a different group was solving the problem, keeping the aircraft off American carriers. The British Royal Navy received Corsairs under Lend-Lease beginning in 1943, and they were desperate for capable carrier fighters. The Royal Navy couldn't be selective. They had limited options and resources. They had to make the Corsair work aboard their carriers or do without entirely. British engineers approached the Corsair's problems systematically, treating them as engineering challenges rather than fundamental flaws. They modified landing gear, oleo struts, to handle heavier deck landings more smoothly. They clipped 8 inches from each wingtip to fit aircraft into lower British carrier hangar decks. This modification had an unexpected benefit. The shortened wingspan improved sink rate, making the aircraft less prone to floating across the deck. Clipped-wing Corsairs came down faster and more controllably. Most importantly, Fleet Air Arm pilots developed a new approach technique revolutionizing Corsair carrier operations. The traditional American approach was a straight run toward the deck from astern. The pilot would line up behind the carrier, descend to proper altitude, and fly straight in until touchdown. But in the Corsair, this meant the pilot couldn't see the deck during final critical moments. That long nose blocked everything ahead. The British developed a long curving approach they'd already used with Seafires, which had similar visibility problems. The pilot would fly a continuous left-hand turn around the carrier, keeping the ship visible off his left side throughout the approach. He could see the flight deck the entire time by looking out his left window. Only in final seconds would he straighten out and commit to landing, when he was so close that even the Corsair's poor forward visibility didn't matter. This technique allowed pilots to maintain visual contact with the deck throughout most of the approach. dramatically reducing accidents. The Royal Navy was the first to operate Corsairs successfully from carriers in sustained combat operations. The first Fleet Air Arm Corsair Squadron, 1830 Naval Air Squadron, formed at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, in June of 1943. British Corsairs first saw combat in April of 1944 during Operation Tungsten, attacks on the German battleship Tirpitz in Norwegian waters. Fleet Air Arm Corsairs would serve extensively in the Pacific with the British Pacific Fleet, demonstrating conclusively that the aircraft could be operated safely from carrier decks when proper techniques were used. Meanwhile, Vought engineers and Pacific field mechanics were implementing modifications addressing the Corsairs' most dangerous characteristics. Some fixes were remarkably simple. Sailors fashioned stall strips from simple wood blocks, small protrusions attached to the right wing's leading edge just outboard of gun ports. These strips disrupted airflow over the right wing, causing it to stall simultaneously with the left wing instead of slightly later. This eliminated the sudden snap, roll, killing so many pilots. The asymmetric stall became a symmetric stall, still dangerous, but far more predictable and controllable. Factory-built metal stall strips were soon incorporated into all new production aircraft. Landing gear oleo struts were modified with greater air pressure, eliminating much of the pronounced bounce, causing aircraft to leap back into the air after touchdown. This single change dramatically reduced landing accidents. The original birdcage canopy with numerous frames obstructing visibility was replaced with a clearer bubble canopy, giving pilots much better view of surroundings. The pilot seat was raised 7 inches and the tail wheel strut lengthened 6 inches. These changes combined to significantly improve the pilot's forward visibility, allowing them to see more during critical flight phases. The modified aircraft, designated F4U-1A internally, represented the first truly carrier-capable Corsairs. They retained all the speed and power of the original design, while being significantly safer to operate. By late 1944, the Navy officially cleared the Corsair for shipboard operations. The Ensign Eliminator was being tamed. The aircraft that had killed so many of its own pilots was finally becoming the weapon it had always promised to be. By late 1944, Corsairs began returning to American carrier decks. Marine Squadrons VMF-124 and VMF-213 became the first Marine squadrons based on a fleet carrier when they deployed aboard USS Essex on January 3, 1945. These squadrons struck Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands in the first Marine airstrike launched from carrier. The Corsair had finally achieved what its designers intended. It was operating from carriers, and it was devastating. During the Battle of Okinawa in spring of 1945, the Corsair truly came into its own as the premier American Pacific fighter. The Japanese had unleashed their kamikaze offensive, sending nearly 2,000 suicide aircraft against the American fleet in desperate attempts to destroy the invasion force before it could secure the island. Corsairs, faster with superior climb performance compared to the Hellcat, were ideally suited for intercepting these incoming waves before they could reach vulnerable ships. Marine Corsairs flew from carriers and captured Okinawa airfields, providing close air support to Marines and Army soldiers fighting ashore while defending against kamikaze attacks. Armed with bombs and rockets, they struck Japanese fortifications and troop concentrations. Armed with machine guns, they shot down kamikazes by the dozen. Their effectiveness was so remarkable that Marines fighting the brutal ground campaign gave the Corsair a new nickname reflecting their gratitude. They called it the Angel of Okinawa. Ground troops knew that when Corsairs appeared overhead, close air support was coming. They could call in strikes on Japanese positions holding up their advance, knowing bent wing fighters would deliver devastating firepower with remarkable precision. The distinctive Corsair silhouette became a symbol of hope for Marines pinned down by enemy fire and a symbol of death for Japanese who faced its guns and bombs. The transformation from Ensign Eliminator to legendary weapon is captured in war end statistics. Corsair pilots flew 64,051 operational sorties for Navy and Marines through the conflict. Of these, 54,470 were flown from land bases and 9,581 from carrier decks. The aircraft rejected for carrier duty flew nearly 10,000 carrier sorties before war's end. In aerial combat, Corsair pilots claimed 2,140 enemy aircraft destroyed against only 189 Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. This represented an overall kill ratio of more than 11 to 1, one of the highest of any fighter in aerial warfare history. The aircraft that struggled in its first combat engagement had become the most effective fighter killer in the American inventory. The Corsair also proved itself as a formidable fighter bomber carrying heavier bomb loads than many dedicated bombers. During the war, Corsairs dropped 15,621 tons of bombs, representing approximately 70% of all bombs dropped by American fighter aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Armed with bombs, high-velocity aircraft rockets, and 650 caliber machine guns, the Corsair provided devastating close air support to ground forces throughout the island-hopping campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But one statistic reveals the dark side of the Corsair's story, a reminder of the price paid for eventual success. Navy and Marines lost 189 Corsairs in aerial combat against enemy aircraft. They lost another 349 to ground fire during attack missions. But they lost 1,435 Corsairs in non-combat accidents. For every aircraft shot down by Japanese fighters, more than 7 were lost in training accidents, operational mishaps, and the dangerous business of carrier landings. The Ensign Eliminator continued claiming victims even as it destroyed enemy aircraft at unprecedented rates. The Corsair's production run was the longest of any piston-engine fighter in American history, testament to its effectiveness and versatility. From production start in 1942 to final delivery in 1953 to the French Navy, 12,571 Corsairs were manufactured in 16 separate models. Vought built original F4U variants. Goodyear produced FG models. Brewster manufactured F3A versions until production shut down due to quality control problems. By late 1944, Vought alone was producing 300 Corsairs per month, one complete aircraft every 82 minutes. The Corsair served not only with the United States Navy and Marine Corps, but also with the Royal Navy, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and French Navy. 2012 Corsairs went to the British. 364 served with New Zealand. The French operated Corsairs into the 1960s. The aircraft saw combat in World War II, Korea, and French colonial wars in Indochina. When war erupted in Korea in 1950, Corsairs were among the first American aircraft engaging the enemy. They flew close air support missions in brutal Korean winters, supporting United Nations ground forces. On September 10, 1952, Captain Jesse Falmer of Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 312 achieved something remarkable. Flying his propeller-driven Corsair, Falmer shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter in aerial combat. It remains one of the few instances in history of a propeller aircraft defeating a jet fighter in air-to-air combat, testament to American pilot skill and enduring Corsair capability. The F4U Corsair story offers profound lessons about innovation, failure, and redemption extending far beyond military aviation. Rex Beisel and his team designed an aircraft of extraordinary capability, optimizing every aspect for speed and power. But in that optimization, they created something killing the men who flew it. Changes required to meet Navy demands for armament and range transformed a promising prototype into a deadly trap. The Navy's initial response was rejecting the aircraft for its intended purpose. This was reasonable given available evidence. Pilots were dying at alarming rates. The aircraft couldn't safely operate from carriers. Many would have considered the Corsair a failed design, a cautionary tale about pushing too far, too fast pursuing performance. The easy path would have been abandoning the Corsair and focusing on safer designs. But the Marines, desperate for a capable fighter, refused giving up. They accepted the risks because they had no better options. They learned to fly it despite its dangers, developing tactics exploiting its strengths while minimizing exposure to weaknesses. British engineers, equally desperate for carrier fighters, found solutions to problems stumping American planners. Field mechanics and test pilots identified specific fixes for specific problems. The raised seat, modified struts, stall strips, curving approach pattern. None were revolutionary innovations. They were practical solutions developed by men who needed the aircraft to work and refused accepting it couldn't. The Corsair transformation speaks to fundamental truth about complex systems and potential's nature. Potential and performance aren't the same thing. The prototype Corsair exceeding 400 miles per hour in 1940 possessed extraordinary potential. But realizing that potential required years of refinement, countless modifications, new tactics, new techniques, and ultimately accepting the aircraft's limitations alongside its capabilities. Pilots who succeeded in the Corsair weren't those trying to make it something it wasn't. They were those who learned fighting on its terms, using its speed and power while avoiding situations where weaknesses could prove fatal. They climbed high before engaging. They attacked from above. They used speed to escape, not maneuverability. They adapted to the aircraft rather than expecting the aircraft to adapt to them. Today, the Corsair's distinctive bent-wing silhouette remains one of aviation history's most recognizable shapes. Surviving examples fly at air shows worldwide, their massive engines producing sounds that thrilled Allied troops and terrified enemies more than 70 years ago. Audiences watch in awe as these vintage machines demonstrate the speed and power that made them legendary. Kenneth Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed victories and lived until 1998, passing at age 81. Gregory Boyington survived Japanese captivity and received his Medal of Honor from President Truman in October of 1945. He died in 1988 at 75, still remembered as commander of the war's most famous Corsair squadron. Rex Beisel continued designing aircraft after the war, eventually retiring as United Aircraft Corporation vice president. He died in 1972 in Sarasota, Florida, having lived to see his most famous creation recognized as one of the greatest fighters ever built. The Corsair began as a dream of speed and ended as a legend of redemption. Its story reminds us that the path from innovation to success is rarely straight. Breakthrough designs often carry hidden flaws. Early failures don't define ultimate potential. And sometimes the greatest weapons are those that had to be tamed before they could be wielded effectively. They called it the Ensign Eliminator because it killed young pilots who tried flying it. They called it the Angel of Okinawa because it protected Marines who fought beneath its wings. Both names were earned. Both names tell truth about an aircraft simultaneously one of the most dangerous and most effective machines of the Pacific War.